And welcome back. Now, a new report by Transparency International called the Global Corruption Barometer Africa has revealed that with over 35 African countries surveyed, corruption and bribery in the police sector is most prominent. It also found that more than 1 in 4 citizens who access public services such as healthcare, education or others paid a bribe in the previous year. And this is equivalent to approximately 130 million people on the continent. David Lewis from Corruption Watch is here to tell us more about this, including South Africa's position in all of this. Thanks so much for coming through, David.
Pleasure, Sakina.
Once again, this report, very interesting, but, you know, it does make for some very grim reading. Because if we start off by, for example, taking a look at South Africa's score in this particular survey, 43 out of 100. And we only have 8 countries in Africa scoring 43 or above. And our ranking, 73 out of 180. What does that tell us?
I mean, those are the rankings of the Corruption Perceptions Index, which was conducted earlier this year, or released earlier this year, conducted some time back. It puts us in the category of countries that have a serious corruption problem, the score of below 50, and we're at 43. You know, I seem to recall that when we started this business, we were ranked something of the order of about 30. We're now ranked something of the order of about 73, in the 70s. So it does show a serious problem, which I don't think will come as any news to South Africans, and clearly they're the ones who are being surveyed. But this latest report, the Global Barometer, is a particularly interesting report because it breaks down corruption into different sectors, and I think is a real guide to solutions and action, actually, which I think is gratifying and is important.
Part of the problem, of course, is that the barometer found that corruption is on the rise, and the perception by citizens also indicates that more than half, about 55% of citizens actually believe that corruption is on the rise. That can't be good.
Yes, you know, it's not good, and it sounds to me like a fairly accurate reflection. You know, I'm sure that to some extent it's been, although the survey was probably conducted a little early for this, but I think next time you'll see, I think people have been shocked by the revelations at the Zondo Commission, even though many of these have been known, many of the revelations have actually been known before. But I'm sure that this will influence their perception of whether corruption is on the rise or not. But, you know, I think the everyday experience is that it is. And, you know, for most of us, we read about the big corruption stories in the newspapers and on television because of our work, which involves collecting reports from ordinary South Africans. You see that the real burden of corruption and incidents of corruption happens, you know, in housing allocation queues, in paying at public hospitals for free services, in dealing with licensing authorities. And this is really something that is getting much too little attention because it's every bit as large and every bit as systemic as the grand corruption narrative that we hear at the Zondo Commission. And, you know, to some extent, if ordinary people featured more prominently in those surveys, I think you would find the incidence of reported corruption would increase significantly, because for some people it reflects all of their experiences with the public sector.
What was interesting was that the barometer also shows that poor people were more likely and were the ones paying more bribes than rich people. And
it figures because they're more vulnerable. You know, it's to some extent, when you think about it, no-brainer. I mean, you know, firstly, you know, middle-income people and richer people don't rely on public services to anything like the same extent. So we have our private security and private transport and private education for those who do. That's not the case for poor people. They're constantly accessing public services, and they are more vulnerable to being to having bribes solicited from them than are more privileged people.
But But what's the solution? Because, ideally you'd like to eradicate this scourge, but 2 out of 3 people who were surveyed actually feared retaliation if they were to report corruption. So how do you then go about dealing with this and trying to make some meaningful inroads? If you look at whistleblowers and the fate that they normally suffer, why would people even come forward?
Yeah, no, point taken. I mean, on the whistleblower issue, I think that the way to deal with it is to really celebrate whistleblowers publicly. It's difficult to imagine more legislative reforms. In fact, most people would be surprised to know that our legislation is as good as anywhere else in the world. There are things that can certainly be tightened up, but the trick is to make of whistleblowers heroes rather than impimpies, and it's extraordinary how many people still view whistleblowers as snitches. I feel that our task is to make them the kind of heroes that they are, even though the whistleblower thing starts to get complicated in the grand corruption narrative when you find sometimes, and see the Zondo Commission, that some of the best whistleblowers are people who have been very complicit in corruption themselves, like Mr. Greasy. It's difficult to celebrate somebody who's doing this because he has calculated it's in his interest to do, rather than, but that's the way to deal with whistleblowers, I think.
And I want to bring that in and come to the Zondo Commission and talk to you about that, because it speaks to this whole corruption narrative that goes on. But the role of foreign actors in actually fueling what is going on. And again, Zondo Commission touching on some of these things. But, what sort of role, how complicit are they in the sort of bribery and corruption that we see happening on the African continent?
Deeply complicit. I mean, big multinational corporations from developed countries who would not behave in their own countries in the way they behave in Africa or Asia or Latin America are deeply, deeply complicit. And we in South Africa know that at first hand. I mean, the arms deal, all of the companies involved were foreign companies, and from countries in which corruption perception is at a relatively low level. Britain, France, Spain, Germany. So they're deeply complicit, and in the current state capture narrative, we've seen McKinsey, KPMG, SAP, Bain. So yes, they're deeply complicit, and one of the principal recommendations of the report is that the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development Convention on prohibiting bribery of foreign officials, be enforced more strongly. And there are indications from countries like the United States and Britain, with effective policing agencies, of greater enforcement of the Convention Against Foreign Bribery. But they're deeply, deeply complicit. Deeply complicit.
And just talking to the Zondo Commission, because one of the things that's mentioned in this latest barometer is that if you look at countries like South Africa, for example, they mention the work being done by the Special Investigating Unit. They mention the Zondo Commission explicitly, as measures for trying to curb corruption and trying to fight the scourge. What's your take on what we've seen thus far, especially what happened yesterday with former President Jacob Zuma?
Yeah, I thought yesterday was riveting and very revealing. I mean, there was that long, rather rambling narrative at the beginning, which indicated a sort of rather vengeful and bitter person who was going to do whatever he could to take down the ship with him. But I found particularly interesting his admission. He doesn't even seem to realize that he'd done anything wrong. His admission that it was he who initiated the setting up of the Gupta media empire. It wasn't as though that they even approached him. He approached them. He even named the New Age newspaper, which is the one big dot that was clearly revealed yesterday. The other dot is that Themba Maseko was instructed to use government funds to assist them. Now, Zuma claims that he forgot about that, but if you put that together with the fact that he actually started the thing, and I imagine the Gupta said to him, sure, number one, we will start this, but it's going to be a bit costly, that it makes sense that he would have used government funds to support
with all of this,
them.
David Lewis, none of what we heard is new once again. Why are we struggling as a nation to actually take action against some of these allegations? Why are they not being tested? Why are people not being tried in courts of law?
Well, you know, one of the reasons, the principal reason, is that the first institutions that were captured were the key criminal justice institutions. So crime intelligence, I mean, I think one of Zuma's first acts as president in his first term was to appoint Richard Mdluli as head of organized crime. The police services itself, the NPA, IPID, these are all institutions that have been gutted in the Zuma administration, and that's the reason why we haven't seen prosecutions. I think that now we have appointed as heads of many of those organizations people of integrity and competence, but they will be the first to admit they face an enormous task in dealing with the legacy of the Zuma administration.
Given what has happened during the Zuma administration, given how we saw state institutions being hollowed out, what guarantee do we have that these very institutions will not continue to be, or will not again be used to fight these political battles?
We have no guarantee whatsoever. The only guarantee is our own vigilance. You know, we thought in 1994...
Which is very low, by the way.
Well, it's not so low. If you see that I think quite a high proportion of those surveyed believe that public pressure is the most effective instrument, and that they are willing to participate in public protection.
Are we, for real? Because the previous guest, Xolani Dube, actually makes the point that given what was testified at the commission last week, you have Bruce Kolwane, former state protocol chief, who is now the ambassador to the Netherlands, making damning admissions, and yet he gets to walk out of there and straight back into his cushy position.
Well, that's a good point, because that is action, at least removing him from his post, that is entirely within the hands of the president. And I think...
so why didn't the president act?
Well, I hope he's going to. I hope he's going to, because I think, you know, it's become a litmus test for all South Africans, exactly what you're saying, that there have to be individual consequences for this. There he stood, basically took the bullet for Zuma, is really what he did, by sort of blatantly acknowledging this, and he needs to be punished.
Well, we need to talk more about this, because one would have thought that there would be some more immediate consequences to what transpired there. But thank you all the same, David Lewis from Corruption Watch, for talking to us about this new report titled the Global Corruption Barometer Africa, and of course how this plays into our current political situation and the country's outlook as a whole. It's time for News with Leanne.